how and why has Putin attempted to stake this claim over the areas? And does it matter to him at all if it's an untransparent process that lacks credibility?
Well, you've answered the how. These are made up figures. This isn't a vote. The why is perhaps more interesting because this wasn't planned for now. This was rushed, and it was rushed because, as we know, as you saw, Ukraine captured huge amounts of Russian-occupied territory in Kharkiv in the northeast a few weeks ago, and that threatened Russian positions to the south in what we call Donbas, which was, the whole point of this war. It's what Putin launched it for. He said, "I'm trying to liberate Donbas," even if we know his real aim was to conquer Kiev. And so that threat made him rush these referenda, these fake referenda. And what he's trying to do now is, by incorporating them into Russia, by redefining them as Russia, he can say any Ukrainian attack on these places is an attack on Russia, and therefore might meet with nuclear retaliation. That's what he's been threatening. He's been talking about nuclear weapons to defend against the territorial integrity of Russia. And he hopes, I think wrongly, that we, you and I and all of us listening in the West and in Europe, will panic, will be deeply frightened, and our leaders will say to Ukraine, "Look, why don't you just simmer down? Let's stop these attacks. Let's have a diplomatic settlement. Let's stop giving you advanced weapons." I think that's what he hopes, and he hopes it because his military options are running desperately short.
I mean, it might sound like a naive question, but is he a chess player, Shashank? Is this all a plan in stages that makes actual rational sense, at least to Vladimir Putin and the people who surround him? Because that sounds like a very, if you will, in a sort of Bond villain sort of way, clever thing to do.
I think Russians, of course, are very, very good at chess, Marilla, historically, aren't they? But we have, over time, I think, built up Putin as some kind of, master villain, Bond villain, master strategist. Actually, he has utterly botched this. This move is a move not out of strength. It's a move out of weakness and desperation. I look at the military very carefully. His military is a wreck. It's lost huge numbers of people, probably 60, 70,000 wounded and killed in total. And he's lost the best generation of his young officers. And so he may be trying to rescue a bad situation by seeing if he can escalate, make nuclear threats, annex, try and force the West back onto the back foot. But all of this is because he did not realize he would find himself in this situation come the autumn.
But how credible are his threats? He can escalate if he wants to, can't he?
Well, he can, but of course, he's not the only one with an escalatory option. What we saw in the past week is Jake Sullivan, America's national security advisor, threaten catastrophic consequences if Russia were to conduct I apologize for the background noise, by the way. I'm at Heathrow Airport, so
don't worry. You're doing.
You can hear.
You're doing far better than a lot of our guests. I can assure you.
I'm very pleased to hear it. Look, he can escalate, but the important thing is, if he uses these weapons, what happens next? He also has to calculate that, and I think what we would see, with very high likelihood, is a devastating American or American-led military attack on his forces in Ukraine. And what sort of position would that leave him in? Would he gain or would he benefit from having used these weapons in that context? So I think we must always remember he is not the only one with options to escalate. We can, Ukraine can, America can, others can as well.
And just finally, let's not forget that in annexing these regions, there are individuals who live there. There are Ukrainians living there. What does it mean for life for them?
Well, I think it's really difficult because some of them are pro-Russian, but we must always remember being pro-Russian before the war doesn't mean you're pro-Russian now when you've watched Russia destroy lots of your towns and cities. That's very, very important to remember. I think we've seen that dynamic in lots of these places in eastern Ukraine. Now, what it means is your children are perhaps being sent to filtration camps and sent off to Russia, which is a war crime. Perhaps they're being taught a Russian curriculum by Russian teachers and being re-educated and being told they must be taught in the Russian language. Perhaps you're being ruled by Russian occupation authorities. In fact, the former head of Russia's space program is just being put in charge of Russia's the occupied annexed territories in Ukraine. So you're living life in a sort of, Vichy France type regime, an occupied regime in which your education, your language, your schooling, your workplace, your rules are being run from a foreign country. And I think that's just absolutely devastating for these people.
Sorry, one last question. I know you're at the airport dying to get off probably, but what does it mean if eventually, when eventually, let's hope, Ukraine wins the war? Will these regions have to be dealt with separately as a result of what's clearly opportunistic and, in terms of voting, irrelevant annexation of these regions?
First of all, I'm in no rush. I'm heading to Helsinki shortly, so I have all the time in the world to discuss Russia. I think that what's very important to understand is that Ukraine is not going to really pay any attention to this. And in fact, look what happened yesterday. We saw the Biden administration announce yet another arms package for Ukraine. I think it was about $1.1 billion. It included, over a number of years, admittedly, 18 new HIMARS rocket launchers. These are the rocket launchers that have been conducting really devastating attacks on Russian positions. It only has 16 at the moment. And look what it's done with those. So we are going to see Ukraine try and recapture these places without regard to their legal status, without regard to whether they're claimed by Russia or not. I think the difficulty, Mariella, comes in as one of these places, which is Crimea, which of course was illegally taken by Russia back in 2014. And there is, I think, a sense, although people don't want to really admit this, that it is more important to Russia. They are more jittery about it. And if Ukraine were to mount a serious attack on Crimea, that some of these Russian escalatory threats might be a little bit more credible than some of the others.